IVM.
Every year, watching the Republic Day parade either in person or on television is a tradition. The parade features bands from all the armed forces, daredevil stunts, displays by the Air Force, and flotillas that showcase cultural heritage from all the states. It's a huge, colorful affair and has been so since the 1950s, when India began the tradition of inviting a foreign head of state for the national salute. Welcome to the Pragati podcast. We're your hosts, Hamsani Hariharan and Pawan Srinath, and every week on the show, we discuss policy, economics, and international affairs. Tomorrow is Republic Day, and we're celebrating the day the Constitution of India came into effect. The day India became a republic, so as to speak, which decided to uphold the rule of law. Republic Day is also an exercise in strategic communication, with new developments in military technology being displayed with so much pomp and rigor. And every year, a head of state of another country is invited as the guest of honor. It's a signal of relations between that country and India. The first head of state to ever be invited for Republic Day was in 1950, when the Indonesian President Sukarno was the guest of honor. Since then, the President of Indonesia, the Prime Minister of Thailand, the General Secretary of Vietnam have all been guests of honors during different Republic Days. But this year is different. All 10 heads of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, are going to be the guests of honor for this Republic Day. And this is significant. India, since 1994, has been stressing on the Look East policy, which decides to change the way India approaches the world and engage more with its neighbors in the East. A few years ago, the policy was repackaged as the Act East policy, which aimed to give it more momentum. Projects like Look East through the Northeast or using the border states on the East as gateway to Southeast Asia have all been touted. But so little has been done. Why? Also, what effect does India's domestic policies have on its foreign policy? My guest on the show today helps with answering some of these questions. I met Dr. Sindapal Singh at the Raisina Dialogues that happened last week in Delhi. He is a senior fellow at the South Asia program at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies at the Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Sindapal, welcome to the show. Tell me this. What should India do to improve ties with ASEAN? And why has so little headway been made so far?
For once at least, this is not totally India's fault that the India-ASEAN thing is not going as quickly as everyone wants it to go. Mainly because ASEAN is facing a crisis of its own. Right? We all know when it comes to the South China Sea, which is the major issue confronting the ASEAN states in their relations with China, there is no clear unity on how it should be approached. Right? So you got the claimant states, the non-claimant states, and you got some states which, for lack of a better word, seem to be more inclined to listening to China. And so when India comes to look at ASEAN, it increasingly doesn't see ASEAN as one, and that's not surprising. What can India do? I guess a lot of ASEAN states want India to play a bigger role. And recently in the maritime realm, that has come up a lot. Right? Singapore and India just recently signed an agreement which allows Indian warships to use Singapore's naval bases for refueling, etc. This is a good step because what the ASEAN states want is for India to play a bigger role within Southeast Asia, defense, especially in the strategic realm, especially in the maritime strategic realm, so that there is another great power in the region which can check other great powers' sometimes irresistible need to, push everybody aside. Especially because we don't know what Donald Trump is going to do. So India's role in Southeast Asia becomes even more urgent. So far, from what I understand, Southeast Asian states are very sanguine. Under Modi, they think that India wants to expand its cooperation, its presence in this part of the world, Straits of Malacca, down towards Vietnam. So, let's see. I think that's one of the major issues. On the trade front, things are always being negotiated. I think the CICA Plus at the moment has stalled, but there's always a chance that they can negotiate thing. So basically, I think one is the maritime realm, India's presence, and number two is, I think, in terms of trade and investment. These are the two things that I think India can do more.
This is easier said than done. Of course, maritime cooperation with Southeast Asia seems like an obvious starting point. In one of our earlier podcasts with Devi Yashodharan, we spoke about how trade flourished from the time of the Cholas and how India even established diplomatic relations with the Song dynasty as early as the 10th century. After decolonization, however, trade between India and these countries has majorly slowed down. And now, if we do speak of India-ASEAN trade, it is most of the time against the context of China's trade with ASEAN countries. And this is almost double what India has. So India needs to play a bigger role, a lot of people say. But foreign policy is often not as binary as that. How do we contend with people who look at it in such binary terms like competition and cooperation?
I don't think it's a secret that majority of Southeast Asian states, if you use a linear between 1 to 10, some think that China is being aggressive. On the other hand, saying China is a peaceful country. I think most Southeast Asian states will range between 5 to 10. There's a huge amount of concern about Chinese intentions, right? So it's accepted that China will become stronger and stronger economically and militarily. That in itself for Southeast Asian countries is not a problem. But what do you do once you become that strong? And they also understand China's domestic compulsions, right? So a lot of things sometimes China does is because it does it for domestic reasons.
Yeah.
But the Southeast Asian states suffer for it, right? So that is one way of looking at China, that China, we don't know what's going to happen. With India is a known quantity. So no one in ASEAN is saying India will become an aggressive power. No one. The fear, of course, is if India-China hostilities break out to a level where they actually come to a full-scale war, very bad news for Southeast Asia. You don't want to take sides.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
That's the Southeast Asian view. You don't take sides. And if American and Chinese hostilities break out, then again Southeast Asian states are in a very big bind, because most of the foreign policies of Southeast Asian states are dependent upon not having to take decisions where you have to take a side. You don't want to be put in a position where you have to make a choice, because that's the way you keep your security, you balance each other, the great powers up.
What Sundar Pal mentioned as India not being perceived as bad for Southeast Asian nations can't necessarily be seen in terms of good or bad, in moral terms. In international relations, we call this balance of threat. It's when you perceive some nations as a threat depending on your own national interests. ASEAN's been praised and criticized for this role that Sundar Pal mentioned, for keeping larger powers vested in the region and for playing them against each other. On one hand, it means that countries can extract maximum benefits from all the powers by keeping them vested in the region. But does this also mean we can only look at relations through a purely economic lens?
I think that your point about trade is correct. I think it does not mean that because India's trade with Southeast Asia is much lower compared to China, that somehow its defense relationship should be similar. If you actually look at the Singapore-India relationship, it wasn't trade that started first. It was in the defense realm in the early 1990s, right? The Air Force, and then later on, I think, the Navy came the last. I think Air Force and then land.
Yeah.
So you can see that it is not necessary that economic relationship needs to come first. Of course, economic relationship is very important because the interdependence that gives you, and then your constituents at home feel a stake in the relationship. That's very important. So if you have to make unpopular decisions, at least your constituencies, businesses mostly, who say, no, this relationship is important, we need to take the relationship with India further, we may have to do some compromises, fine. So it's about building constituencies at home which have a stake in the bilateral relationship, which is important. And of course, I think the other thing that India has been doing quite well is trying to harness the diaspora in Southeast Asia. Then again, India has done it really well. I think it can be a potentially dangerous thing to do because sometimes diasporas can be labeled as, fifth columns. But in the case of Indians in Southeast Asia, that hasn't happened. We all know stories about how Chinese diasporic communities are now looked upon with some amount of suspicion.
Yeah.
But hasn't happened in the Indian diaspora. And in fact, it's showing the links between Southeast Asia and India, which is a good thing, which is a really good thing. I mean, this soft kind of, I wouldn't use the power, but these soft communities that you form, again, it's about giving communities a stake in the bilateral relationship.
Yeah.
You know, if a Singaporean Chinese goes to India 3 times, they feel something about India. Tomorrow, you have to make a foreign policy choice and you have to compromise slightly domestically. There's another constituency will say, yeah, you know, that's an important bilateral relationship. So I think that becomes really important.
This is interesting because Indians often claim they share a lot in common with people from Southeast Asia because of the spread of Hinduism and Buddhism and diaspora. But we don't know if people in these countries respond positively to these assertions. The way to bridge this would be to allow people to travel more, to try and accommodate various narratives that stray away from the majoritarian Indian one. An other interesting point that Sindapal raised is how domestic policy affects foreign policy. Often, we think the two exist in silos, devoid of any contact. And this got me thinking, how does domestic Indian politics or policy affect India's external posturing?
Well, I think when the Modi government first came to power, the strange thing was that during the election campaign, foreign policy didn't figure much in the campaign. But interestingly, we see the first few moves he makes are not necessarily domestic. The domestic move come later. We got demonetization, GST, which come way later. But straight off the bat, there were a lot of foreign policy moves, trying to invite all the SAARC countries' heads to his inauguration, trying to reach out to Pakistan, for example. So there were very important moves, even towards Southeast Asia, ASEAN. Very, very interesting moves, that very bold, and people started calling it the Modi doctrine. And so that whether academics have been discussing whether there's such a thing as a Modi doctrine. I think one clear thing that has slightly changed, or already changed quite significantly, is the relationship with the US. So I guess, in a sense, it's no surprise this government doesn't suffer from the kind of political baggage that a Congress government has to carry, because close relations to the US, as you know, always come in for a lot of domestic criticism in India, right? The US is an imperialist power, they always do what they want to do. But I think this government has moved very significantly, especially in defense. We know the logistics sharing agreement, the intention to buy US armaments, weaponry. I mean, the Russians have been replaced as the number one source of armaments for the Indian Defence Forces by the US, right? Yeah. So that is a huge breakthrough. Yeah.
And how do you think this also has changed with the Trump presidency coming into power? Because now you're relying on a foreign power whose own legitimacy as a world power is being questioned.
I think everyone in the world is really grappling with the Trump administration, the Trump presidency. No one knows. I think people in DC don't know what he's going to do tomorrow or day after. But I think India is slightly fortunate because I think from the get-go, Donald Trump sort of saw Modi in a similar light. A guy who was an outside. So Modi's an outsider to Delhi, a straight talker. Also, I guess, in the same sense, nationalist, if you want to use that word. So, in a sense, Donald Trump sort of openly has said that he thinks Modi is a great leader, a bit like himself. The small problems have been, of course, the visa issues, H-1B, and which again cuts to the core of Donald Trump's domestic program, but will affect India. But I think everything else being equal at the moment, India hasn't really suffered that much under the Trump presidency. But of course, there is this notion that there's so much of uncertainty. We don't know what they're going to do. Because for India, the worst thing would be if America retrenches its military presence in Southeast Asia, especially, right? We're talking the alliance partnership with the Philippines, even with Thailand, and Americans decide that they don't want to have the alliance partnership with Japan. These are very troubling for India, obviously, because you give China a whole vacuum to step into, and that's not good news for India. Yeah.
Fair enough. And you're right, India hasn't suffered a lot from under the Trump presidency. But what's interesting is that the issues that now pertain them are, visa issues, which is a domestic policy that Trump's been riding on.
Yep.
What similar domestic policies in India do you think have affected its foreign policy?
I think, to some extent, the policy towards Pakistan, to be fair, has always been driven by domestic politics, right? I mean, we all know that. So, on some level, I guess this government felt a lot of pressure to respond to terrorist activities that were happening in what we call Tier 2 Indian cities, Gurdaspur, especially some attacks in parts of Kashmir. And that cross-border raid was a symbolic attempt to, I think, assuage some sections of Indian society that, unlike the earlier governments, we walk the talk, right? That we will do something. Of course, everyone realizes that long term, that whatever happened or didn't happen in that cross-border strike is not going to change Pakistan's ability to use proxies to do what they want to do. That needs a bigger effort, and I think India alone cannot do it. But in that sense, I think that one issue on Pakistan is definitely driven by domestic politics. It's not surprising, obviously. The other issue, I think, but which Modi is finding difficult, is the economic liberalization front. A lot of countries want India to open up even more, right? This coming from someone who's in Southeast Asia. Of course, people like Singapore want India to open up more. People in Southeast Asia want India to open up more. The US wants India to open up more. But there we find a slight contradiction, because part of the constituency which is popular, or which finds Narendra Modi as a good prime minister, the small traders, is going to hit them, because if you open multi-brand retail, small shops are going to go. Someone's going to have to suffer, right? And that, in a sense, has also constrained some parts of Modi's foreign policy. You look at the Singapore-India free trade agreement, right? The SICA plus that we were supposed to negotiate, it's basically broken down because of certain, I think, domestic issues. Singapore's got its own domestic issues, of course, but so does India. So on the trade front, that level, the domestic contradictions are still something I think this Modi government is trying to work out. Right? I mean, I'm sure you read in the news recently that certain trader groups have come out against the allowing majority share, foreign share in certain sectors. This is going to be a problem. How the BJP manages this domestically will impinge some parts of its foreign policy when you go and negotiate trade deals abroad.
And this is also interesting because on one hand, India, along with China, has been someone who's been calling out against protectionism on the world stage, right? But it's still something they have to consolidate on the inside. I mean, they're talking about how, India's ease of doing business has increased.
Yep.
But there are other issues in terms of India's own domestic policies. Another thing that I was thinking about domestic policies is also the Rohingya crisis.
Yes, of course. Right? Yeah.
What do you think?
The Rohingya crisis has put India in a very, very difficult spot. I was actually in Myanmar just last year for about a week doing a couple of interviews, and obviously you get the sense that people in Myanmar feel very strongly about the Rohingya crisis. They say these people are not they're not Myanmar citizens, they shouldn't be here. And also one gets the sense there's quite a deep anti-Islamic sentiment within Myanmar at the moment, for various reasons, whether legitimate or not, that we can discuss later. India now finds itself in a difficult spot, mainly because India-Bangladesh relations have not been as good as now, has not been as good recently as they ever been before. I mean, this is one of the best phases of the India-Bangladesh bilateral relationship. I mean, the things that have been done in the last 3 years were thought to be impossible before. Now, we know that Myanmar and Bangladesh are now at a standoff. I mean, they come to some agreement, but the problem India finds is if it criticizes the Myanmar government's handling of these people, whether you call them Bengalis, you call them Rohingyas, then Myanmar gets upset. And that's another relationship India really needs to work on. It's working on very well. From the connectivity viewpoint, India is building this India, Myanmar, Thailand trilateral highway. Progress is being made. But if you don't condemn it, then Bangladesh gets upset, right? So you find yourself in a very difficult point. You can see Foreign Secretary statements, Jaishankar's statements, try to find a in-between line which is equally non-offensive to both. But at the moment now, the agreement is they will send 1,500 back a week.
Yeah.
If that happens, then they'll be good for India because at least it seems that the process of people coming back is happening, so they don't have to say anything.
The Rohingya crisis, which the United Nations has called the textbook example of ethnic cleansing, has been an issue not only for India and Bangladesh, but for countries in Southeast Asia as well. However, as far as responses go, the ASEAN as an organization has not taken a stand on it because member states have been unable to reach a consensual decision regarding the matter. One of the reasons the Indian government hasn't taken a stand of its own is because of its own borders with Myanmar. But this creates a new issue. The catchphrase when we now speak of ASEAN policy is looking east through the northeast, developing the northeast so that it can serve to connect India with Myanmar and further Thailand and other continental Southeast Asian countries. And one obvious example is people talking about how road trips between India and Myanmar and Thailand will become a possibility. But the India-Myanmar-Thailand trilateral highway has been under construction for years now. How much do these efforts even bear fruit?
At my institute, we're actually doing a big project on the Northeast connectivity with Southeast Asia. I think one major problem, of course, is if you look at land connectivity through Myanmar, which was the reason for my visit in Myanmar recently, there are big problems. And it's always fashionable to blame Indian bureaucracy for everything that doesn't happen. But even on the Myanmar side, there are huge issues because the part which is being connected, those areas, for all practical reasons, the Myanmar government doesn't have control over, right? So that's one big problem. How do you lay a road through those areas? And I've talked to people who on the Indian side will be in charge. The challenges are insurmountable because to build 3 or 10 kilometers of road takes you a long time because there's tribal land in Myanmar and all that. So that is one issue. The other issue in terms of look east and through northeast is the northeast areas. I was in Mizoram recently. The problem is that whether the northeast people fear that they're just going to become roadside towns, right? That the goods will come, but they'll be going to Kolkata, they're going to Delhi, they're going to Mumbai. What about them? And so I think that issue again has to be resolved. It's, in a sense, it's quite a sweet spot for India at the moment because in Northeast, we're only left with insurgency, more or less, in Manipur. Nagaland, we're not still so sure, but everywhere else, more or less, the normalcy in terms of insurgency has basically gone. So this is a sweet spot, time to take it up. The problem, of course, is to get industry to go into the Northeast. What are you going to do? So is the Northeast going to become a place where manufacturing is done? Some people are suggesting bottling, canning facilities. But of course, the Northeast, people in Northeast would like that, but they also want higher value-added jobs to go to the Northeast. So that's going to become another problem. They're a highly educated population, speak English very well, high levels of literacy. So again, they fear. The other problem with this border connectivity is that, see, everybody just assumes that openness is a good thing, right? I mean, this is a liberal market talk. The more open you are, the better. Not everybody feels the same way. You ask the intelligence services who are based there, they see open borders is a very dangerous thing because besides goods, other things come. Illegal immigrants, insurgents, narcotics, small arms. So that becomes a big problem. So I think there still needs a bit of thought about how they want to negotiate what's going to happen in the Northeast. And I think that's, in the Northeasterners are also not sure. Some states in Northeast are happy that the borders be open. Some are not. I mean, Assam is an excellent example where people want the border to be closed.
And the calls for the inner line permit and all
exactly,
of that.
the inner line permit. In Mizoram, again, when I went, there was a split. Some people say, yeah, it's good. Some people say, allow us. I mean, there is some trading, but on a very low level where you got these huts where people exchange goods and all that. And people are allowed to move freely from Mizoram into Myanmar and come back. The problem, of course, is if you make this more open border, what comes in, what comes out might become more difficult. And knowing intelligence services, they are very wary. The intelligence people I spoke to, after a bit of prodding, said that they worry about how this The economic rationality of opening up is talked about, but not the security elements.
Sindarpal is right. Foreign policy problems are knotty and there are no easy answers. What we can hope for and what the Indian government should work on is pushing the completion of existing projects, disbursing funds and sketching out finer details for increasing engagement with the region. While we're doing that, you can go ahead and enjoy the Republic Day parade this year. That's it for this episode of the Pragati podcast. If you have any comments or suggestions, write in to podcast@thinkpragati.com. You can listen to the Pragati podcast on the IVM podcast app or any other podcasting service under the sun. We'll see you next time.
He bends down to test the warm water for his bath. He comes here to quench his thirst for a hot shower and some podcasts. You can witness how he enjoys having other people talk about cool stuff in his bathroom. Indeed, it helps him with his loneliness. You can find more of his pieces on ivmpodcast.com, your one-stop destination where you can check out the coolest Indian podcasts. Happy listening.